Significant partner, I think, is what would describe the best the current status of our relationship. We had 10 trust funds at a certain point with more than 40 million euros in it. And Ukraine has been one of the partners who have contributed to all NATO's missions and operations. Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. The most important focus needs to remain on the reforms. And it's not just the armed forces who are joining NATO, it's a whole country which is joining NATO.
Hello everybody, we are glad to welcome you at the new issue of Persona Grata, the format that Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism is introducing to our friends and colleagues, where we meet the diplomats of different countries or organizations who are working in Ukraine and talking about the agenda of bilateral relations, multilateral relations, about their views of Ukraine and those challenges, but also possibilities that we have for the future. And today I'm glad to welcome here at our studio Barbora Maronkova, who is the director of the NATO Information and Documentation Center in Ukraine. Thank you for coming and talking with us today about NATO and Ukraine.
Thank you very much for the invitation. My pleasure as always.
And I will start with the question that is obvious. You're here for 3.5 years, so you have more than enough experience and knowledge about what is happening here. How do you feel about these 3.5 years? Is it any development in the perception of Ukrainians towards NATO? Is it any shift in this understanding of what is NATO?
Well, I would very much hope so. Otherwise, my 3.5 years would not have been so successful here, and I don't deserve my salary. But no, on a more serious note, I really believe that we have, of course, jointly with all our partners in civil society, but also on the government level, jointly really pushed the public debate about NATO and Euro-Atlantic integration much more forward than it was, I believe, ever before. We have some opinion polls also which can help us to show and indicate that the level of public support has gone up steadily over the past 3.5 years. Particularly what I feel very strongly about is the increase in eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. There is still a lot of work to do, of course. The thing with the public support is that it's very flaky, and you need to work constantly day by day, step by step to maintain it or to work with it to increase it. So it's not a job done, it's not finished. It's a beginning, but I believe that we started off nicely.
What are the 3 main topics that you needed to communicate with the 3 years about NATO here?
Well, first thing is to speak generally about what is NATO. How does it work? How does it look like? What are the member states doing? What they are not doing, for example. So really some basic ABC about NATO, because it's a fairly complex organization and it's a lot of specificities that are not perhaps as clear or as simple to people as it seems. The second is we really try to push out proactively on NATO's support to Ukraine, particularly after 2014, both in terms of political support but also practical support to Ukraine, because the allies have been doing a lot of different projects. We had 10 trust funds at a certain point with more than 40 million euros in it. Different other programs like professional development program, training civilian government civil servants from security and defense sector institutions about NATO and Euro-Atlantic integration, but also other training programs. So all of this shouldn't be lost in the space and should be communicated to the people of Ukraine so they understand how much NATO supports Ukraine.
When we speak about the focal point, the primary source of information about NATO in Ukraine, for your opinion, who should be the first? Your office, or the NATO representation as a whole, let's say, or the Ukrainian government, because Ukrainian government announced the NATO membership aspiration, so they also need to contribute to the awareness campaign about the NATO in the country. So who should be the first as a source of information?
Well, the NATO Information Documentation Center, as the name suggests, we are the NATO Information Office, and in fact Ukraine is one of the very few countries that actually has the privilege of having its own dedicated office in Ukraine. For the rest of the partner countries, or majority, this is done by my colleagues from Brussels, and our mandate is to inform Ukrainian citizens about what is NATO. However, the primary responsibility for communicating about NATO to its citizens rests with a country itself. This is enshrined in a report already from 1956, which was approved at that time, and focusing on the need of information for citizens and populations, and thus creating this sort of information service. So just as we have this primary responsibility to communicating about NATO to its own citizens within the NATO countries, the same applies to the partner countries, and particularly those countries that wish to join NATO. I mean, we cannot communicate it for you. If the government of any given country, including Ukraine, takes the decision that it wishes to join the alliance, it's their primary responsibility to explain to its citizens why do you want to join this organization, and what are the benefits of joining, but also what are the commitments and obligations.
Who are your primary target audience in Ukraine? For the last 3 years, whom you saw as the primary target audience for all the communication campaigns that you've been studying here?
Well, we have several target audiences, because if we really want to have a broader communication efforts, we need to have various target audiences. The primary one are, of course, usually the civil society organizations and experts who deal with foreign and security policy. We call them so-called opinion formers, key opinion formers. Then, of course, it's the journalists. And the work with the media, which is very, very important. Also, universities, professors, students, so the whole academic community is very important. But also, for example, parliamentarians are very important target audience, and the civil servants who are working in respective ministries or agencies, who are tasked, let's say, with the work or preparation of issues and reforms towards Euro-Atlantic integration. So we believe they're also an important audience.
In 2019, Ukraine made changes to its constitution, stating exactly that NATO membership is our ultimate goal. Do you feel that after this in Brussels, we can say about all European capitals, but at least in Brussels and the headquarters, the perception of the affirmation of Ukrainian aspiration has been changed, that it is more trust in Ukrainian wishing to join NATO?
Well, the changes in the constitutions were, of course, a very important signal, and the allies took note of the wish of Ukraine to pursue its Euro-Atlantic integration ambitions. However, the most important focus needs to remain on the reforms. The reforms are really key to any future possible steps towards a future membership of Ukraine to NATO.
And Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I mean, it is the elephant in the room when we speak about Ukrainian-NATO cooperation. Do you feel that it is the main obstacle for Ukraine to join NATO? Or do the menu, let's say, has much more variety and much more options? What else can prevent Ukraine from the successful NATO integration?
Well, maybe I'll start from a little bit backwards, if I may, and actually give a context to the whole discussion about how a country can join NATO. Because very often we tend to forget actually these more bureaucratic, technical issues and focus more maybe on the political issues or the issues that citizens take, discuss often, like for example, the one that you mentioned. We have NATO's open door policy. This open door policy remains valid. We have the commitment from the NATO allies from 2009 Bucharest summit that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, which was restated on many other occasions, including last year at the NATO leaders meeting. We also have a so-called study on enlargement, which was adopted already in 1995, and this study gives very clear, let's say, guidance on what a country needs to do and how it needs to do it to prepare for membership. And we have all the instruments and tools at our disposal. I mean, Ukraine has, such as the Comprehensive Assistance Package or the annual national program, the AMP. And this is where we can really work together to prepare Ukraine on its way to Euro-Atlantic membership.
What, for your opinion, are the three main expectations of NATO about Ukraine?
I'm afraid I'll be very boring, because it's reforms, reforms and reforms.
Okay, but we always can clarify what type of reforms.
Absolutely, and I'm worried that a lot of the Ukrainians are very tired of us saying this over and over again, but unfortunately there's really no other way. When I was, for example, dealing with Montenegro before they joined NATO, it was the same thing. They said, please don't come to Podgorica anymore if you're just going to say we need to do reforms. Nevertheless, we have to stick to this very important topic. To be more concrete, firstly, very generically speaking, functioning democratic institutions, independence of judiciary, fight against corruption. This is common with, for example, the European Union. Good neighborly relations, we all know that, and this is a difficult part for Ukraine, but nevertheless, this is an important part of it. Then we go deeper into really specific reforms of defense and security sector. Here we have a lot of work in the Rada, which needs to be done, and this has to be done by Ukrainian parliamentarians. We need to adopt a lot of laws, which will help then to really do the reforms that are actually needed. So the reform of the Secret Service of Ukraine. So first we need the legislation for that to be passed in Rada, and then actual implementation of the reform of the SBU. Then we have, for example, the law on intelligence, particularly military intelligence. Then we have a law on issues like secrecy of information or defense procurement, etc., etc. I can go down the list. Great news from yesterday is that President of Ukraine, President Zelensky, has approved the National Security Strategy of Ukraine, which is a very important document stemming from the law on national security, which was adopted 2 years ago. And now from this, we also need all the other subsequent strategies, such as military strategy, strategy on Ukraine's foreign policy, strategy on cybersecurity, strategy on information security, etc. And on the third, really like the very, very specialized NATO standards, interoperability, issues related to the Ministry of Defense, Armed Forces and General Staff of Ukraine, such as military education, command control system, logistics, etc. So, as you can see, there's so much work to do. And what I'm always saying is that it's not just, let's say, the armed forces that are joining NATO, it's the whole country which is joining NATO. Reforms take many years. In average, it's a decade for every other country which was joining NATO. And although we know how difficult it is to carry the reforms and keep the momentum, this is really the only way.
As you already started to speak about annual national program, and let's be honest that a lot of people who are not deeply in the subject, when they are opening it, they are starting reading it, and the beginning it's like, okay, but that is the same as what we have for the association agreement with the European Union. What is the sense? Like, NATO is seen first of all as the military organization, as the classical security organization, and for most of the Ukrainians it is completely not understandable why there should be things about courts in Ukraine, for example, judiciary, about some anti-corruption things. Here in the NATO program, but not, okay, for European Union it's more comprehensive, so there people understand why it is there. So if you would explain it, why it is so important to have these things not only duplicated, but in general included for the future perspective and cooperation with the defense organization?
Firstly, because as I already mentioned, it's not just the armed forces who are joining NATO, it's a whole country which is joining NATO. And NATO is a collective security organization. So it's not just a military or defense organization, it's a collective security organization. And one of the key principles of NATO is that we share values and principles of democratic governance and democratic principles and values. Therefore, it is very important for us that our member states adhere to the generic principles, and if they are correlated together with the requests or requirements from the side of the European Union. I can speak as a Slovak citizen. When we were joining both organizations, in fact it was actually easier for us because part of the homework was already done, and this is how I believe it should be seen. It's about strengthening your democratic civilian institutions.
The new thing in NATO-Ukraine relations, what is done in 2020, that Ukraine finally received the status of the enhanced opportunity partner. That is quite a, on the one hand, it is increased level of partnership. On the other hand, as we discussed, it is quite a vague status because, I mean, it is not the set of rules what is inside of it. How do you think why that is important for Ukraine-NATO cooperation? What new it can bring to the dialogue between Kiev and Brussels?
The Enhanced Opportunity Partner program is in fact a part of a larger interoperability partnership initiative which was adopted at the NATO summit in Wales in 2014, and it was actually to maintain and strengthen the interoperability and the practical cooperation between NATO and its most important partners who have contributed significantly over the past 2 decades to NATO's led missions and operations. And Ukraine has been one of the partners who have contributed to all NATO's missions and operations, starting already in Bosnia-Herzegovina back in '95. So what this enhanced opportunity partner status gives or offers to Ukraine is a tailor-made package of an access to information sharing, trainings, exercises, and lessons learned, for example. It is really up to Ukraine to use, and if I may say positively misuse, whatever can be offered and used within this program. So it's quite a flexible format, and it really gives an opportunity to Ukraine to contribute both to our, for example, lessons learned, yeah, but also the other way around. So Ukraine can learn from our lessons learned in let's say, military operations or something similar. So I believe this is a really a great opportunity for Ukrainian, particularly military colleagues, to strengthen their knowledge, capacities and capabilities, and bringing them closer to NATO standards.
EOP is granted to Australia, Jordan, the countries that never been members of NATO and never had such aspirations that are understandable from their geography, but at the same time Ukraine and Georgia. So definitely in Ukraine at least there are certain fears that EOP can be the substitute for the talks about the future membership. It's understandable not a substitute to the membership itself, but about the open dialogue about the future membership. There are fears that NATO would say, okay, you have EOP, let's for the next few years speak only about EOP, but not about possibilities and changes that you need for the membership. For example, membership action plan that is really awaited in Ukraine. Do you feel that such fears are reasonable, or it is the added value that can just contribute to the Ukrainian talks about the membership?
Well, firstly, I think it's really important to understand and distinguish what this EOP actually is. And as I said, this is really an initiative which was fostered in 2014 as we were winding down and drawing down our decade-long operation ISAF in Afghanistan. And at some point we had more than 50 contributing nations. So of course we didn't want all these knowledge and relationships and what we learned from each other with our partner nations which are contributing to be lost or forgotten. So that's really, we are talking about mostly military cooperation and partnership and working together in crisis management operations together with NATO or contributing to the NATO response force or similar. The EOP status does not prejudge any decision related to Ukraine's membership or to the membership action plan. This is a complete separate track. We noted Ukraine's aspirations on Euro-Atlantic integration. We stand by the decision, as I already mentioned, that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, and we have very clear instruments and processes in place related to Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO.
And as a conclusion, if I would ask you to say your three main associations when you hear Ukraine-NATO, what would it be?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, the first thing, particularly looking at you, is looking at the map here, is of course the Black Sea. And the Black Sea security, because we discussed this a lot together, and I have visited Odessa on many occasions, and that's something that will always stick to my mind. Secondly, really significant partnership which has developed since 2014 really significantly. The amount of practical programs that NATO offers to Ukraine is really unprecedented. So the significant partner, I think, is what would describe the best the current status of our relationships. And the third issue is perhaps what Ukraine gave us, not just NATO, but collectively, is the hybrid threats and the hybrid warfare experience. It's a sad one, of course, but I think through Ukraine and through the loud voices of many brave Ukrainian activists and grassroots people and journalists, we really understood much better what hybrid warfare really looks like.
Thank you very much for being with us today, and I hope that we'll see you again in Ukraine in your new capacities, and that there will be more NATO in Ukraine and more Ukraine in NATO.
I wish you all also the best, and don't forget, reforms.
Thank you.